Imagine this situation. You're on a wild night out, preferably on holidays abroad, and you're in a busy club. A good-looking stranger makes eye contact and soon approaches to dance while handing you a drink. As they hint at a possible late-night party in more private locations, you head out of the club with them. Then a dark fog of oblivion descends upon you. You wake up in a hotel room, and you realize you're missing some hours of the previous night. And very soon, you find out you're missing something so much worse: a kidney. The events we just described could be easily dismissed as an urban legend. And they kind of are. Well, at least in the way we describe them. But the reality is people are currently being trafficked for the sole purpose of illegally harvesting their organs. Organ harvesters are not likely to target their victims in a nightclub, but their modus operandi is no less shrewd, callous, and calculating. After all, to them, the criminal trade of kidneys, livers, lungs, even corneas is just that. It's a trade. It's a business. It's a business that's worth hundreds of millions of dollars every year, and that's probably just the tip of the iceberg of a global economy lurking in the shadows of conflict, crisis, and exploitation. So first of all, let's clarify what we mean by the illegal trade of organs. In legal terms, this trade encompasses two different crimes: organ trafficking and the trafficking in persons for organ removal. Those two criminal activities have been clearly defined by the Declaration of Istanbul on Organ Trafficking and Transplant Tourism, drafted by the Transplantation Society of the International Society of Nephrology in 2008 and reissued in 2018. According to the declaration, organ trafficking is defined as the removal of the organs from donors without their valid consent or in exchange for financial gain or other advantages to the donor and/or a third person. Those same organs cannot be transported, manipulated, transplanted, or otherwise used, and no undue advantage can be offered to any healthcare professional, public official, or private sector employee to facilitate or perform organ removal and use. This definition is based on a key concept sanctioned by the Declaration, quoting here: "Organ donation should be a financially neutral act." Now, body parts cannot be sold to patients, healthcare professionals, let alone intermediaries. Likewise, unscrupulous traffickers cannot promise money to potential donors. As per the crime of trafficking in persons for the purpose of organ removal, it is worth quoting the entire definition, as it does include some very important details. The recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of the threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power or of a position of vulnerability, or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of the removal of organs. Now look, our legally qualified viewers may want to chip in the comments here, but we understand that it is important to keep these two crimes separate. As we shall explore later, it is not always straightforward to identify, indict, and prosecute those responsible for trafficking organs. It's much easier to report, prosecute, and convict those who traffic persons for the purpose of organ removal. Okay, now that we've defined what the illegal organ trade is, we should address why it exists and why there's a need for it. Well, to put it simply, organ transplants can save lives. When no medical intervention can prevent, slow down, or revert organ failure, a patient can benefit from a transplant. Medical professionals will thus look for a compatible donor, a relative, a friend, even a recently deceased person who had previously consented to their organs being donated. There's a problem, though: a worldwide shortage of ethically available organs for transplant. According to the Global Observatory on Donation and Transplantation, more than 150,000 transplants are performed worldwide every year. But this is less than 10% of the actual need. As a result, according to the WHO, 25 people die every day waiting for an organ. Now, some patients, and their relatives, if needs be, are therefore willing to take desperate measures, including buying organs procured on the black market, with kidneys being the most sought-after commodity of a monstrous trade. Okay, now, if you're watching our channel, you are likely not to fall victim to the illegal organ trade. If our viewer stats are correct, you're probably a citizen of the US, the UK, or another industrialized English-speaking country. Hello, fans. Whereas those coerced into donating their organs by traffickers are largely refugees, migrants, asylum seekers, who are fleeing from authoritarian regimes, war-torn countries, humanitarian crises, or desperate economic situations. According to the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, the typical victim of the illegal organ trade is a young adult male aged around 30 years old. As we shall see later, there are many exceptions, but most cases involve young men coerced into selling their kidney or other body part as a means to pay for their transit to Europe or to provide for their families in their country of origin. While the specific crime of organ trafficking might take place all around the world, the crime of trafficking in persons for organ removal tends to be concentrated in Northern Africa, the Middle East, the Indian subcontinent, and Southeast Asia. Areas plagued by armed conflict, especially civil wars, tend to experience a peak in this specific crimes rates. For example, in 2017, the Syrian civil war caused mass displacement of civilians into Lebanon, which fueled the illegal trade. According to Syrian officials, between 18 and 20,000 civilians were forced to sell an organ, mainly kidneys, from 2011 to 2017. At least part of this trade may have been exploited by the terror group ISIL. In January 2015, they released a fatwa, or edict, sanctioning the harvesting of organs from captured enemies. And the ongoing conflicts in Sudan and the Horn of Africa have produced a similar effect, with refugees falling prey to traffickers, mainly in Egypt. Even in areas where a conflict is not being waged, impoverished residents may resort to donations for sustenance. This is the case in the infamous Kidney Valley in Nepal, a rural region in which, according to anti-trafficking activists, most families have at least one relative who sold their organs for cash. Donors are often taken to India, where the illicit surgery is then performed. In all the above cases, what is truly tragic is that these transactions leave the victims much worse off than before and drowning in debt. Frequently, victims are not paid the entire fee they were promised, and even if they are left to deal with serious post-operative complications from infections to chronic pain and fatigue. As a result, they are unable to return to work and very often have to spend all their money on additional medical care. Another tragic consequence of the trade is that victims may be categorized as criminals. First of all, because many of them are illegal migrants. Second, because by accepting payment from the traffickers, they may be charged with organ trafficking themselves. In their situation, they're likely not to speak to authorities, which means that any data we may have about the illegal organ trade is tainted by massive underreporting. And this is made even worse by the authorities' lack of cooperation and awareness. According to Cyril Gout, Interpol's Director of Operational Support and Analysis, quoting, "While trafficking in human beings for organ removal is not a new phenomenon, it is underreported due to the clandestine nature of the crime, combined with a lack of awareness by law enforcement agencies and the deficiency of information sharing channels between the medical and police sectors." Even so, the numbers we do have are staggering. As of the early 2020s, it is believed that about 10% of all transplants performed worldwide are illegal. In 2017, think tank Global Financial Integrity, or GFI, combined a study of all known cases of illegal sales of the top 5 most trafficked organs: kidney, liver, heart, lung, and pancreas. In total, 11,966 organs were sold that year, with kidney and liver topping this grim chart, accounting for 89% of the total. The price paid for the recipients of the transplants to traffickers varies greatly depending on the geography and type of organ, but ranges between $50,000 and $290,000. That's $64,000 and $373,000 in 2025 value. Of course, the donors will see only a fraction of that money. They might be promised up to $10,000 for a kidney, but then receive a payment of $5,000 to $6,000 if they get it at all. Based on the GFI numbers, in 2017, the total value of the illegal organ trade may have amounted to £1.7 billion, adjusted for inflation, $2.2 billion. And again, this figure is most likely a very low estimate due to underreporting. And now it's time to look at the actors who participate in this complex and tragic trade. First, there is the donor, sometimes referred to as the vendor. As mentioned earlier, donors are usually vulnerable individuals, residents of developing or war-torn countries. They may be recruited online or in person, and they're then convinced to donate their organs through promises of cash and a barrage of lies, for example, that their kidneys will grow back after surgery. Sometimes they are forced or tricked into signing papers claiming that they are consenting donors, or even that they are related to the patient. Next, you have the central figure of the trafficker, also known as a broker or scout. The scouts will often operate in small teams or larger syndicates, identifying the patient in need, the vendor, and even the medical professionals who will perform the surgery. These individuals might work in conjunction with human traffickers or smugglers of illegal migrants. Sometimes they combine all of these functions, offering safe passage to another country in exchange for an organ. The main function of these experienced scumbags is to broker the deal between the parties involved, securing the highest cut for themselves. In doing so, they might even orchestrate competition among donors, pressuring them into accepting lower fees. As per the medical professionals, these include surgeons, nephrologists, anesthesiologists, and nurses. They might be part of the trafficking syndicates and thus operate in makeshift clandestine clinics. Sometimes a single corrupt physician might be able to manipulate or trick a legitimate medical team at an established hospital into unknowingly conducting an illegal transplant. On other occasions, established hospitals might be well aware of the illegal provenance of the organs. Nancy Sherpa Hughes, professor of medical anthropology at UC Berkeley and co-founder and director of human rights project Organs Watch, was able to track trafficked organs to hospitals in New York, Los Angeles, and Philadelphia, described as broker-friendly. Other public and private sector employees may get involved in the trade either willingly or unwillingly. These include travel agents specializing in so-called medical or transplant tourism, translators, even corrupt law enforcement. And finally, there are the patients or recipients, the individuals who are willing to purchase the organs. Typically, they are middle to high-income residents of developed countries or high-income individuals in developing nations. Besides these known actors, there may be other puppet masters lurking in the shadows as well. In 2024, Dr. Sean Cullum, reader in law at Liverpool University, had the opportunity to interview a Sudanese organ broker active in Egypt. The broker discussed the involvement of corrupt doctors in the trade, adding that, quote, "The doctors are not controlling the business. The people who control this business take a commission from the doctors. You don't know them or what they do. You just know that those people take a commission from doctors. They control the business, the organ trade." When Cullum asked the broker if those people were government officials, the broker replied simply, "They are people higher up." Now, the parties we described might interact according to several different models. It's worth exploring some specific cases of organ and people trafficking to understand the different guises in which this monstrous trade might manifest itself. And please note that in the following section, we will not use the real names of the victims involved. The first scenario is one by which people and organ traffickers exploit the plight of political refugees, such as the cases of 3 Eritrean young men, Samson, DeWitt, and Jonas. Samson escaped Eritrea in the early 2010s after being imprisoned on charges of opposing the government. After crossing the border with Sudan, he was immediately arrested by the local security forces, who then sold him as a prisoner to the Rasheda, a Bedouin tribe. The Rasheda eventually took Samson and other prisoners to an isolated house in the Sinai Desert, where they were held at ransom. Samson soon realized that the tribal leaders were harvesting kidneys from their captors. As he told Australian radio SBS in 2014, "The house was full of human bodies. If you pick anything from the ground, you find human hairs, bones. These bodies were the people who died after their kidneys were taken. After the operation, they dumped the body in that house. There were bodies that were thrown outside as well." According to Samson and Eritrean activist Soler Jahar, the organ removal was performed by professional surgeons who were driven to the Rasheda's House of Horrors. The harvested organs were then placed in cooled containers, driven to Cairo or to Israel, and then flown to the patient's countries of residence. Samson lived to tell the tale, of course. With an incredible act of bravery, he and another 34 prisoners staged a mass breakout against their armed guards. Only 11 of them survived. DeWitt, too, escaped from Eritrea, in his case, to avoid forced conscription at the age of 13. DeWitt made it to Sudan, where a broker called Ali suggested that he sell a kidney for a fee of $5,000. As the young man told The Guardian in 2019, "How could I say no to $5,000 when I have nothing and my family need help?" DeWitt and Ali, the broker, crossed the border into Egypt and then drove to Giza, where the surgery was performed. While convalescing, DeWitt was introduced to a fellow Eritrean, Isaac, who promised to smuggle him to Sicily. Ali would take care of paying Isaac after he'd sold DeWitt's kidney, that is. After spending several days in a weakened state, DeWitt made contact with Isaac and Ali to arrange his journey to Italy, but both of them had vanished into thin air after taking DeWitt's money. When the young man reported the events to the Egyptian police, he was threatened with deportation. A Sudanese broker called Ali appears also in the account of yet another Eritrean refugee called Jonas. Ali is obviously a very common name, but the modus operandi is very similar. Aged just 14, Jonas escaped forced conscription in September 2012 and then spent several years working as an undocumented migrant in Sudan, Egypt, and Libya. After trying to cross the Mediterranean in April 2018, he was detained by Libyan authorities without due process. He had to pay a large bribe to regain his freedom. Completely out of funds and heavily in debt, Jonas reached Cairo, where Ali the broker offered him $10,000 for his kidney. Unlike DeWitt, Jonas did receive a payment, although it was only for $6,000, barely enough to pay his debts, but not sufficient to attempt a crossing to Italy. However predatory, the actions of the organ traffickers that we just described can be described as passive. In other words, by lurking at strategic nodes, these criminals can intercept vulnerable individuals trying to escape a hostile regime or migrate to Europe. Other traffickers may take a more proactive approach, targeting their victims with fake promises of work. This is exemplified by the cases of Asha, Santosh, and Daniel. Asha, a Sudanese woman, was approached by a syndicate in Khartoum who offered her a job in Cairo and later transport to Italy. Asha was not in a position to refuse, as she told The Guardian in 2019, "I did not trust these men, but it was impossible for me to stay in Khartoum. My children were sick from not eating, so I listened to them." Once taken to Cairo, the traffickers told Asha that they had no intention of helping her. They would be harvesting one of her kidneys instead. If she complied, she would receive $2,000. If she did not, they would take the organ by force. With no other option, Asha accepted the deal, but later reported one of the brokers to the police. In this case, authorities did arrest the trafficker, but released him after 30 days without charges. And what's worse, the broker and his associates threatened Asha's children should she speak to the police again. Quoting her, "I am worried, what will happen to my children? I am worried they will come for their organs too." A young man called Santosh, living in Nepal's infamous Kidney Valley, suffered a similar ordeal. In June 2022, he was offered a new job in India, and traffickers took him first to New Delhi and then to Kolkata. There, he was driven to a hospital and told he needed to complete a blood test in order to receive his work visa. Santosh was drugged instead, and the complicit doctors removed one of his kidneys. Santosh was eventually found and returned home thanks to the efforts of Nepal's Anti-Human Trafficking Bureau, led by Chief Investigating Officer Dan Burda-Mala. Speaking of PBS, the top cop explained how people trafficking for the removal of organs is perpetrated by large, well-organized crime syndicates. Quoting him, "Human trafficking in Nepal is an organized crime, and the nexus of traffickers is well connected from here to other countries. This is modern slavery, and we all need to do more to stop this." End quote. Mr. Mala and his investigators told PBS that each new victim they identified would lead them to the same Kolkata hospital, the Rabindranath Tagore International Institute for Cardiac Sciences. According to PBS, the hospital has been in the headlines for illegal kidney transplants in the past, but has never been prosecuted by Indian authorities. The Kolkata hospital had actually been investigated in June 2021 following a high-profile case about an organ trafficking ring operating in the state of Assam, northeast India. On that occasion, the hospital had issued a statement claiming that they had received the necessary affidavits and no objection certificates from all parties involved. We can find similar elements in the case of Daniel, who was at the center of the UK's first prosecution of human trafficking for organ removal. In May of 2022, at the age of 21, Daniel was lured from his native Lagos, Nigeria to London with the promise of a life-changing job opportunity, but the traffickers in charge had other designs in mind. Daniel was taken to the private patients unit at London's Royal Free Hospital alongside a young woman who was introduced as his cousin. Now, Daniel did not speak English, so he could not really understand what was going on. Only much later did he realize that the brokers were tricking the unknowing surgeons at the Royal Free into transplanting one of Daniel's kidneys into the recipient. Luckily, the Royal Free clinicians realized that Daniel had not given his informed consent and thus halted the process. When this plan failed, Daniel was still watched over by two members of the syndicate, also Nigerian. One day, the two discussed taking Daniel back to Lagos and having his kidney removed there. Luckily, Daniel was within earshot and promptly escaped to the police, triggering the ensuing investigation. By June 2022, Detective Sergeant Andy Owen had cracked the case, identifying the main parties involved. The recipient was Sonia, daughter of multi-millionaire Nigerian Senator Ike Ewamadu, and his wife Beatrice. The two had initiated the search for a kidney with the help of chief broker Dr. Obina Abeta. On March 23, 2023, Mr. and Mrs. Ekwamadu and Dr. Abeta were found guilty of people trafficking for the removal of organs, are receiving sentences of up to 10 years. In the examples we introduced, the trafficking of organs and donors was perpetrated by individuals, small criminal groups, or larger syndicates, potentially with protection from above. There are also anecdotal accounts of illegal trade being conducted by more organized armed groups, such as militias in South Sudan. But what if the harvesting and trade of organs was to be performed on an even higher level by an even larger entity, like a country's government? More precisely, the government of the People's Republic of China. Back in 2021, the UN expressed concerns about credible information regarding the, quote, forced organ harvesting in China, which appears to be targeting specific ethnic, linguistic, or religious minorities held in detention, often without being explained the reason for arrest or given arrest warrants at different locations. The quote ends. Then, in April 2022, the American Journal of Transplantation published a paper titled Execution by Organ Procurement, Breaching the Dead Donor Rule in China by Matthew P. Robertson and Jacob Levy. The authors reviewed 2,838 Chinese medical papers about transplant surgery, finding evidence that in 71% of these publications, quote, brain death could not have properly been declared. In these cases, the removal of the heart during organ procurement must have been the proximate cause of the donor's death. Because these organ donors could only have been prisoners, our findings strongly suggest that physicians in the People's Republic of China have participated in executions by organ removal. This publication was followed by a May 2022 hearing of a human rights panel within the US Congress. During the proceedings, senior fellow Ethan Gutman from the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation presented his research on the systematic organ harvesting perpetrated upon the Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in the Xinjiang province in northwest China. Based on his findings, Gutman estimated that up to 50,000 prisoners of the Chinese state were subjected to forced organ removal every year. In August of 2024, publication The Diplomat related the story of Mr. Changpei Ming Cheng, who was an adherent of Falun Gong, a spiritual practice or new religious movement persecuted by Beijing since 1999. For this reason, Cheng was repeatedly arrested and tortured for several years. Then on November 16, 2004, he was taken to a hospital in Daqing, northeast China, where he was subjected to forced surgery before being returned to his prison cell. In March 2006, Cheng initiated a hunger strike, which prompted a second forced hospitalization. The prisoner was informed that he would be operated upon the following morning, but Cheng had a stroke of luck. During the night, his guard failed to shackle him, and he thus was able to escape the hospital, quoting him, "I noticed the fire escape on my way to the restroom, and I knew where it was, so I could use this to try and escape out of the hospital. I ran downstairs and called a cab in front of the hospital." Cheng made it to Tianjin, near Beijing, and then escaped to Thailand as a refugee. He eventually reached the US in 2020 after a years-long ordeal. After completing some medical tests, Cheng discovered to his horror that parts of his liver and left lung had been surgically removed. However grim, this discovery was incredibly important. As described by The Diplomat, it confirmed Mr. Cheng as, quote, the first known survivor of China's state-sanctioned forced organ harvesting campaign. If Gutman's figures are correct, the scale of organ harvesting in China alone would increase the reported number of illegal transplants at least fivefold. What is certain is that the crimes of organ trafficking and trafficking in persons for organ removal are definitely not an urban legend, but they are less talked about than they should be. These hideous practices are shocking, frequent, and pervasive, but those who carry them out may enjoy convenient protection, cooperation, and collusion from public and private entities, at least in certain geographies. Moreover, the victims of organ trafficking may be coerced into silence by the traffickers or by the authorities themselves. Thus, these crimes are consistently underreported and risk flying under the radar of lawmakers, law enforcement agencies, medical associations, and the general public. Luckily, there is hope for increased policing of the transplantation community, with increased attention on the part of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. In October 2022, the agency released a dedicated toolkit, including documents and resources to support the prosecution of the illegal organ trade. Its main purpose being to build awareness and capabilities of global law enforcement. And on our part, we hope we've contributed, even if a tiny amount, to raising awareness of the multiple aspects of the illegal trade of organs and the related trafficking of people. But if you'd like to know more, we can recommend the website of the charity The Exodus Road, which was a great resource in steering our research in the right direction. All we can say is that we thank the people at Exodus Road, as well as other charities, as well as investigative journalists and police officers who help the victims of human trafficking and organ trade. Thank you for watching.